In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosures to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger, and yet no war has been declared. No borders have been crossed by marching troops. No missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent.
It's time to recognize that we've come to a turning point. We're threatened with an economic calamity of tremendous proportions, and the old business-as-usual treatment can't save us. Together, we must chart a different course. We must increase productivity. That means making it possible for industry to modernize and make use of the technology which we ourselves invented. That means putting Americans back to work, and that means, above all, bringing government spending back within government revenues, which is the only way, together with increased productivity, that we can reduce and, yes, eliminate inflation.
The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. I'm doing this for the people and for the movement, and we will take back this country for you, and we will make America great again.
Hello and welcome to Inform America. I'm your host, Rich Merritt. Today is October 2nd, 2019. I want to ask you first and foremost to visit the nationallibertyalliance.org. Check them out if you can support and become a member if you can support them. Do it either with your time or money or both, depending upon what you can do. Appreciate it. I believe it's a noble cause. I'd like to ask you also to check out the Boston Broadside, a newspaper that tells the truth and gives you the stories as they happen. They don't make them up like some of the fake news, the lamestream media lying to people. So check it out anyway, see what you think. Thirdly, I'd like you to ask to support my book, Stand Your Ground. Something, I didn't name this intentionally with this in mind, but we should all be standing our ground when it comes to preserving our rights, but we're falling on our face. I'm hoping that the flyer will be put up at the end of the show. There's a link that you can click on, check out the book, see if you'd like it. Other than that, I'm going to show you, this gentleman's name is called Ezra Taft Benson. He's the former president of Brigham Young University. And he warned us back in the 60s about what's going to happen and what is happening today. So I'd like to show you an excerpt from this film and come back and talk about it. Thank you.
Humbly and gratefully, I stand before you, grateful for patriots such as you, humbled by the magnitude of the task before us. I speak to you as a fellow citizen of the United States of America, deeply concerned about the welfare of our beloved country. I am not here to tickle your ears, to entertain you. I will talk to you frankly and honestly. The message I bring is not a happy one, but it is the truth. And time is always on the side of truth. As the German philosopher Goethe said, truth must be repeated again and again, because error is constantly being preached round about. I realize that the bearer of bad news is always unpopular. As a people, we love sweetness and light, especially sweetness. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that every mind must make a choice between truth and prose. Those who will learn nothing from history are condemned to repeat it. This we are doing in the Americas today. George Washington stated, "Truth will ultimately prevail where there are pains taken to bring it to light." To bring the truth to light is our challenge, this day and every day. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Returning recently from 2 years abroad has caused me to reflect seriously on recent trends and present conditions in our beloved country. I am shocked and saddened at what I find. I am sorry to say that all is not well in so-called prosperous, wealthy, and powerful America. We have moved a long way and are now moving further and more rapidly down the soul-destroying road of socialism. The evidence is clear, shockingly clear, for all to see. With our national prestige at or near an embarrassing all-time low, we continue to weaken our domestic economy by unsound fiscal, economic, and foreign aid policies which corrupt our national currency. Ever-increasing centralization of power in the federal government in Washington, D.C., is reducing our local and state governments to virtual federal field offices, while weakening individual initiative, enterprise, and character. With the crass unconstitutional usurpation of power by the executive branch of the federal government, anti-spiritual decisions of the Supreme Court, all apparently approved by a weakly submissive rubber-stamped Congress, the days ahead are ominously frightening. Surely, certainly, it behooves patriotic citizens such as you to meet together to seriously consider present conditions in our beloved nation. It is imperative that American citizens become alerted and informed regarding the threat to our welfare, happiness, and freedom. No American is worthy of citizenship in this great land who refuses to take an active interest in these important matters. All we hold dear as a great Christian nation is at stake. In leaving for Europe 2 years ago, I could not help but feel a very deep sense of anxiety for this great land of America, which had just passed through a terrible crisis. To have the President of the United States suddenly torn from his high office by the violent hand of an assassin was an insidious and dastardly act which struck at the very foundation of our republic. All of us felt the impact of it. All of us caught the ominous spirit of tragedy and sorrow which accompanied it. Each of us sensed in a very personal way the heartbreak which had come to the Kennedy family. But after the services and burial were over, we also realized something else. There was the cold, stark reality that the assassin's murder of President Kennedy was just one more monstrous treachery in the long list of crimes against humanity which have been inspired down through the years by the godless philosophy of communism. It was communism that sowed the seeds of treason in the mind of President Kennedy's assassin. This is something which must not be forgotten and now 2 years and 1 month later, I am appalled at the shortness of our memories. When the events surrounding President Kennedy's assassination were remembered last December, practically no mention was made of Oswald's communist affiliations, nor the present communist threat to our society. Have we so soon forgotten that communism sowed the seeds of hate that destroyed our president, and that communism continually seeks to subvert and destroy our complete way of life? The assassination of President Kennedy, the daily slaughter of our boys in Vietnam, the communist control of the Berkeley riots, and communist-inspired demonstrations from coast to coast should serve as a shock therapy to that segment of our population who like to call themselves liberals. America is big enough to make room for many different kinds of thinking, but many liberals have claimed to see virtues in socialism and communism, which I, for one, have not been able to find. To promote their ideas, American liberals have become a highly organized, hardcore establishment in the United States, and they have been excusing their appeasement and coddling of communism on the ground that they were being tolerant, broad-minded, and working for peace. But the assassination of President Kennedy should have jolted them into a realization that they have been pampering, protecting, and promoting the very nest of serpents which produced Lee Harvey Oswald. The diabolical spirit of murder and violence which struck down the president is that same spirit of communist violence which has been allowed to spread its terror into the heart of every continent upon the face of the earth. Perhaps those who have been apologists for this conquering Marxist, socialist, communist movement might now agree to reconsider the fatal decision they have been following. Two additional things happened in connection with this tragedy which are worthy of comment. First was the speed with which the communist leaders spread the word that the slaying of the president must have been the work of American conservatives. Moscow has conducted a 5-year campaign to make American conservatives look like hysterical fanatics. It has called them rightists, extremists, and even fascists. Within an hour after the assassination and before Oswald was captured, Moscow was assuring the world that this crime was the product of the rightist movement in the United States. The second thing which happened was the amazing rapidity with which American liberals took up the Moscow line. They too were quick to fix the blame, even though there hadn't been the slightest hint as to who had committed the crime. I wonder what would have happened if Oswald had not been captured and identified as an active communist who was in direct contact with party headquarters in New York City. Undoubtedly, the liberal element would be blaming this tragedy on conservative Americans to this day. And even after Oswald was captured and identified as a Moscow-associated communist, there were those who insisted that any who had opposed the president during his term of high office was guilty of the same spirit of hate as that which led to the president's death. This line of thinking was expressed by a number of prominent persons through the press, radio, and TV. To me, it was incomprehensible. To equate Oswald's hate and homicidal bitterness with patriotic Americans who happened to oppose some of the policies of the president's administration was the height of distorted and fallacious thinking. The American people can respect their president, pray for their president, even have a strong affection for him, and still have an honest difference of opinion as to the merits of some of his programs. Another recent development has been the call for national unity. I believe there needs to be unity in our land, but it must not be a blind, senseless, irresponsible unity. It should not be a unity just for the sake of unity. It needs to be a unity built on sound principles. We Americans have strayed far from sound principles, morally, constitutionally, and historically. It has been getting us into a quagmire of trouble all over the world, and especially here at home. Americans at the grassroots level have sensed that their way of life is being threatened. During the last several years, there has been a rising tide of resistance to the prevailing political trend. Compromises with communism abroad and flirtations with socialism at home have stirred up opposition in both political parties. If this has left sound constitutional principles on which we can unite, there would be no virtue in calling for unity to support certain legislation if the majority of Americans were opposed to it. And the fact that both Democrats and Republicans in Congress have at times resisted certain legislation shows that the executive branch of the government may get out of step with the people. I believe the American people know what they want. It would appear that the people want their civil rights safeguarded, but not a destruction of states' rights. The farmers want opportunity for reasonable income security, but not agricultural dictatorship security. Parents want better school for their children, but not a federal subsidy leading to control of the teachings and textbooks as well as the ideologies of the children. People want sound pay-as-you-go spending with a balanced budget, not reckless spending and tax cuts with an unbalanced budget. If there is a need for urban renewal, people want it under local direction, not under the red tape of Washington bureaus armed with confiscatory powers over property. People want the development of power dams, but not the strangulation of privately owned power companies, which have proven far more efficient and economical than utilities run by the government. In other words, there are some legitimate functions and services which the federal government can and should provide. But those who want the federal power to exceed the authority delegated to it by the Constitution will be resisted both by Democrats and Republicans. This is what is happening in some limited areas today. May the trend increase. And anyone who tries to equate this love of constitutional principles as meaning hatred of our national leaders is using Goebbels-style deception. History has already demonstrated that conservative opposition to national leaders was not hate, but an attempt to do them a favor. Let me give you some examples. Was it hate when General Albert C. Wedemeyer pleaded with General Marshall and President Truman to reverse their policy before they lost China? Was it hate when Whittaker Chambers tried to warn President Roosevelt in 1939 that Alger Hiss had been giving the Soviet Union more espionage data than any other member of the Washington spy network? Was it hate when J. Edgar Hoover tried to warn President Truman that Harry Dexter White was a member of the Soviet spy apparatus and was doing great danger to the nation as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury? Was it hate when I went to the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower and pleaded with him not to support the communist Fidel Castro? Was it hate when I urged the President of the United States to go to the aid of the brave freedom fighters in Hungary? Was it hate when the Democratic senator from Connecticut, Thomas Dodd, pleaded for 2 years with the President not to support the United Nations bloodbath against the free people of Katanga? Is it hate when distinguished military leaders advised that an all-out effort could end the Vietnam struggle almost overnight? This list of acts by well-meaning citizens who want and wanted to prevent their presidents from making serious mistakes could be extended at length, but they would all illustrate the same point. History will show that many terrible mistakes occurred because the advice of these well-informed and well-meaning citizens was not heeded. Therefore, I repeat, this kind of resistance to a national leader is rooted in love and respect, not hate. Regardless of which political party is in power, you do not want to see your president make a serious blunder. You don't want him to lose China. You don't want him to allow the enemy agents to make fools of us. You don't want him to lose Cuba. You don't want him to suffer the humiliation of a Bay of Pigs disaster, or allow a Soviet Gibraltar to be built 90 miles from our shores. Every one of these events, which have been so disastrous and which have destroyed freedom for hundreds of millions of our allies, could have been prevented. And the voices of those who tried to warn Washington of what was coming cannot be attributed to hate. It has been out of a love for our country and respect for our leaders that the voice of warning has been raised. What causes one to wonder is why these warnings were not carefully considered and acted upon. Why is it that men in high places in government, regardless of party, have been deceived? I am convinced that a major part of the cause can be justly laid at the door of the socialist communist conspiracy, which is led by masters of deceit who deceive the very elect. J. Edgar Hoover put it well when he said, quote, "I would have no fears if more Americans possessed the zeal, the fervor, the persistence, and the industry to learn about this menace of red fascism. I do fear for the liberal and progressive who have been hoodwinked and duped into joining with the communists." End quote. Therefore, let those who call for unity and the elimination of hate be sure they are not merely trying to silence the friends of freedom. These are who respect their leaders and resist them only when it is felt they are headed for a catastrophe. What patriotic American would wish to stand silent if he saw the president verging on a blunder because of bad advice or a mistaken judgment of the facts? I believe one of the most serious mistakes a president could make would be to weaken the Constitution. From the time I was a small boy, I was taught that the American Constitution is an inspired document. I was also taught that the day will come when the Constitution will be endangered and hang, as it were, by a single thread. I was taught that we should study the Constitution, preserve its principles, and defend it against any who would destroy it. To the best of my ability, I have always tried to do this. I expect to continue my efforts to help protect and safeguard our inspired Constitution. Some 2 years ago, however, a critic from Washington, D.C., claimed that a person who serves in a church capacity should not comment on such matters. He charged that the separation of church and state requires that church officials restrict their attention to the affairs of the church. I, of course, also believe that the institutions of church and state should be separated. But I also do not agree that spiritual leaders cannot comment on basic issues which involve the very foundation of American liberty. In fact, if this were true, we would have to throw away a substantial part of the Bible. Speaking out against immoral or unjust actions of political leaders has been the burden of prophets and disciples of God from time immemorial. It was for this very reason that many of them were persecuted. Some of them were stoned, some of them were burned, many were imprisoned. Nevertheless, it was their God-given task as watchmen on the towers to speak up. It is certainly no different today. To Moses, God said, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof." Why? For God knows full well that the gospel, his plan for the blessing of his children, can prosper only in an atmosphere of freedom. To modern men, God has said, the Constitution should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh. Is the Constitution being maintained, or is it in jeopardy? Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas says the American Constitution is nothing more than a product of the 18th century agrarian society. It is now obsolete, he claims. Senator Joseph S. Clark of Pennsylvania says the separation of powers with its checks and balances must be curtailed because they keep the president from making quick and decisive decisions. Gus Hall, head of the Communist Party USA, agrees with these two senators. Yes, Gus Hall agrees with these two senators and demands that there should be a new federal charter eliminating states' rights. America's national sovereignty should be abandoned, according to Walt Rostow, chairman of the Senate of the State Department Policy Planning Board. He has boldly demanded, quote, an end of nationhood as it has been historically defined. Now, these are some of the same men who see great virtue in a collectivized, socialized society. They want vast powers concentrated in Washington. Samuel Adams of the Founding Fathers said this was the very thing constitutional government was designed to prevent. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. is another powerful influence in Washington and a former presidential advisor. He not only advocates socialism for the United States, but believes that we could eventually form a permanent alliance with communism. He says this would be achieved by having America move to the left, while the communists move to the right. We would then meet at the vital center of the socialist left. The American Constitution, of course, would automatically...
Well, we got last week's show and we have this week's show, and 4 presidents in each one of these shows, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, and Trump, have warned us about what is happening in America, also asked for our help. We ignored them, basically. It's coming from the president doesn't mean anything. Last week's show, we had Robert Welch from the John Birch Society, same thing, warning us on a speech he did in 1958. Paul Harvey, 1965, If I Were the Devil speech. And a couple other ones. I'm not even going to break it down. Mr. Benson here from the Brigham Young University did this speech. I believe it was in the 60s. I can't target the date exactly. But everybody's warning us over the past 50, 60 years about what is happening, and we ignore them. So what chances do I have of convincing anybody? I don't know that I have any. But I do want to say this. Your rights are unalienable. They come from God. If you allow the government to turn your rights into a privilege where they can take it from you whenever they feel like it, then that's what's going to happen. It's not a right, it's a privilege granted by the government because you consent to it. You consent because, pardon my French, I've said it 100 times, because you're ignorant. You haven't read the Constitution, the law of the land jurisdiction. If you read this, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution says there's 18 defined and limited powers. Does the federal government have 18 defined and limited powers? Bull. They have 18,000 limited powers, and they're not defined and limited in the law. They've made them up. If you want to start listening and start fighting back peacefully and lawfully, okay, by not consenting, I strongly urge you to do that. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our Inform America channel on YouTube. Go to our Facebook page and like us. Check out inform-america.org, our webpage. And please share this. If you don't share it, people aren't getting the message. Send it to your family members, even if you don't think they're going to watch it. Send it to them anyway. Send it to your friends. I mean, all of these people are wrong, and we're faced right now with the country going down the toilet for the most part. Yeah, bullets aren't flying. They're not rounding us up in FEMA camps yet, and I don't know if they're going to do that. But there's definitely things to worry about in our country. So I'll ask you anyway to share this with people. Check out my book, Stand Your Ground. Stand your ground, too. It's your rights. Don't let them be taken from you. Thank you for watching.